Hello again everyone and welcome back to Wonderful Aircraft Weekly, and today we're discussing jet engines. Now there are many different types of jet engines and they all accomplish different goals in different ways, but first I'm just going to go over the basics of how just a general normal jet engine works. So this would be a general jet engine, just a normal turbojet engine. Essentially what happens here is you have these compressor blades right here, which if you were to look at them from the front would look something like this, and then have a bunch of little blades all going around them, just very small short blades going all around them, a bit like a saw blade or something. And what those do is they take in air and squeeze it all around there. There's multiple blades here, as you can see. In this case there's 7, but in some there might be 20 or something. So what they do is they force incoming air through a very small area. And when a ton of air is coming in and has to be forced into a small area, it has nowhere to go, so it has to move very quickly and it has to compress and get really crazy. And when those molecules start speeding up and going nuts, they get really hot. And that's what happens when it comes into the combustion chamber right here. What happens here is that super hot, super high pressure air that's been compressed here comes into the combustion chamber, where there are multiple spark plugs that set off little sparks constantly, dozens and dozens of times a second. And what that does is it ignites that air into a huge explosion, an explosion of just tons of power. And then it forces that out through a few more compressor blades and out to a turbine. Now this turbine is at the back of the engine, and it's what finally blows all that crap out of the engine. Now the force of that air is what spins that turbine. The turbine is like if you were to blow on a propeller or something, it would spin. Same principle here. That air is pushing that turbine around and around and around. Now that turbine is also connected to everything here via a long drive shaft, meaning that when this spins, because of the air being pushed through it, it spins everything else, and that in turn keeps the cycle going. A normal engine layout like this was what was seen on early jets and jet fighters and airliners alike. Now this design has huge benefits over propeller driven aircraft. It's faster, of course. It's much better at higher altitudes because it can take in more air even when there's less air up at like 30,000-40,000 feet. However, jet engines always had a problem. They were not fuel efficient at all, and that problem started to become more prevalent when oil and gas prices started to increase, and especially as jet engine aircraft started to be used for commercial purposes. So a solution to this problem had to be found. Now a good way to reduce the fuel consumption of a jet engine is to decrease its size. It doesn't make as much power, therefore doesn't use as much fuel, but also again it doesn't have as much power, so it can't push an aircraft as fast. One of the ideas that was come up with to deal with this problem was something called the turboprop. Now essentially what a turboprop does, it is a small jet engine, just the normal jet engine like we just explained, but it's very small, so it uses much less fuel. But to solve the power problem, it's connected by a long drive shaft to a huge spinning propeller. And you'll see this kind of design on any commercial propeller driven aircraft, or any business propeller driven aircraft, or any sort of high-tech modern propeller driven aircraft. 9 times out of 10 it's going to be a turboprop. Now what the turboprop does is it helps to solve that efficiency problem. You have power because you've solved it by putting a huge propeller on the front of the engine, so it still creates a lot of power and a lot of thrust, but the engine needed to run it is very small, therefore it uses a lot less fuel. But turboprops are not without their flaws themselves. Even with all the advancements in turboprop technology, they are not quite as fast as jets are. And also, propeller-driven aircraft in general aren't as good at high altitudes just because of the way they're designed propellers can't cut through the thin air up at high altitudes as well as a jet engine can. So another solution had to be made, and in comes the turbofan. Now what happens with a turbofan engine is it's kind of a mix between a turbojet and a turboprop. You have a bigger engine than you would see on a turboprop, normal turbojet engine, but instead of attaching a propeller to the front of it, you attach a giant fan that is basically a beefed up version of the turbine at the back of the engine. You'll see this design on all airliners today. You will not see airliners with turbojets anymore. If you look at an airliner, you see that huge spinning fan turbine at the very front of the engine. That's what this big fan is, and what that does is means, once again, similarly to the turboprop, you can downsize the size of the turbojet element of the engine, because that, in most airliners, the turbojet element of the engine takes in about 15% air maybe, while the fan takes in and pushes through more like 85% of that air. So that fan is doing most of the work, and it's creating a ton of thrust. Airliners have a ton of power, but they're able to do that while keeping the size of the actual turbojet itself minimal, and thus reducing the fuel consumption of that engine. Obviously, turbofans aren't as fuel efficient as turboprops, but they are significantly more efficient than a general turbojet engine is. And you'll see them on all airliners today. And they're becoming more and more efficient as time goes on through using lightweight materials or shaping the fan blades in such a way that they're very aerodynamic. Turbofans are now used on almost every single type of jet that is out there. They've basically completely replaced turbojets. Even on jet fighters, they are used, although the diameter of the fan at the front here is smaller, as the engine's diameter in general is a lot smaller on a fighter because it's a smaller aircraft. And speaking of fighter aircraft, there is another element that is used in jet engine technology, mostly for military aircraft. And that element on military and supersonic aircraft for most of the time is something called afterburner, or reheat. And what it does is essentially ignite that hot air twice. As mentioned before, the air goes into the combustion chamber and it's super compressed and super hot, gets ignited and shot out this way. Well, that air that gets shot out is also very hot and very compressed. So what you do with reheat is you have more spark plugs back here that ignite that air once more. So it's a pure, unadulterated explosion being shot out of the back of the engine, and that creates a ton of extra power, and you'll see that on almost any supersonic aircraft and all fighter jets. This creates a ton of extra power, but it also uses a ton of extra fuel, and so it's not used all the time, but it's a great asset to have for any military aircraft in order to be able to get out or get into a situation very quickly. So there you have it. You have your basic turbojet, which is powerful but not very efficient. You have your turboprop, which is very efficient but not as powerful. And you have the turbofan, which is sort of the best of both worlds. So I hope this video helped some of you if you were wondering how this kind of thing worked. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give a like, share it with your friends who would like to know more about jet engines. And with that, keep calm and fly high, and I will see you next time.